Now, one of the irritations on the P38 that I've been tolerating for too long is this. Not only is the handle stiff compared to how it would have been when new, but the moving part of the handle does not correctly recess when you release it and shut the door.
Now, as for such a common issue on the P38, the Land Rover actually came up with a pair of kits to restore the factory action of the door handles, STC 3063 for the left-hand side doors and 3064 for the right-hand side of the car. And it's one of these kits that I'm going to be using today. As well as a kit for each door handle, you also need a few tools. Plastic trim tool for removing the door card without damaging it. A fairly chunky crosshead or Phillips screwdriver for removing the 4 retaining screws in the door card. I found a pair of bent nose pliers very useful. You could probably just use standard long nose ones though. And then you just need a T25 Torx key or head to remove the bolt that holds the door handle to the door. Now on my car, I also needed this 2.5mm Allen key, but I think that's just because someone used a non-standard part when reassembling the door mechanism previously. Later on in the video, you also see me using a flat-headed screwdriver and a household hammer to relocate the retaining pin in the door handle, but I suspect there are other tools or methods you could use to achieve the same thing. So inside each kit, you've got 3 components. You've got this little plastic cam, which is what converts the motion of the door handle being opened into the up-down motion required to operate the latch rod. You've then got this spring, which holds the cam tensioned in the closed position, and then you've got this little metal retaining pin, which is what holds the cam and the spring in place inside the mechanism. Now, for some reason on my car, in place of the pin was this little Allen-headed bolt with a 2.5mm head. I suspect it's just something that someone's used in the past when reassembling the mechanism. I did try to reuse it myself because I thought it'd be slightly easier to reinstall than the pin, but the thread didn't seem to want to bite, so I ended up discarding it and using the pin from the kit anyway. This will all make a lot more sense once we've got the door handle off the car, and the next step in the process to getting that done is to remove the door card from the inside of the door such that we can disconnect the latch rod and the lock rod from inside the door handle. So the card is primarily held in place by these 12 little plastic screw clips that are located all around the perimeter of the card and need releasing from their respective holes on the inside of the door. There's also a kind of a metal clip here which is screwed to the back of the surround for the lock pin, which just locates the top of the card in the window channel. And then you've got 4 screws in various places around the card that also need removing.
So this little plastic panel here is just held on by a single metal tension clip inside. So you just gently ease it out like that, lift it up. It's got a little bit of plastic ridge there that holds it into the top of the door card, and then on the inside the little speaker is just held on by this single grey plastic connector, which we can just release. Put that to one side. Then that reveals one screw just up there. So I'm going to undo that, undo the other screws that I mentioned earlier inside the door pull and also the armrest, and go from there. This one's just a little bit fiddly, so you've got to kind of hold the pull handle open while you do it, and just... Thankfully it's not a particularly deep screw if I recall correctly. Just try to catch that, very good. Just comes out like that. I think. Okay, you just make a kind of crack noise, which slide it up and down. You can actually, once you get one off, you can then sort of slide that in, and you can tell where they are by sliding it came out sort of a bit without so much of a crack, to be fair. Maybe it wasn't quite so secure. Another one, and so on and so forth all the way around the perimeter of the card. Now you've got to kind of feel as you go, because obviously some of the clips will kind of, you'll get two releasing at a time, or one will sort of partially release but not fully, and then but you'll sort of tell when it's kind of ready to come off. Now it is kind of loosely held on at the top as well, just in the window channel there, so it helps to kind of lift it up slightly, and there's a bit of a, just feel a bit of a resistance where the lock pin comes up as well. So I'm just going to lift it up, just ease the lock pin down its little hole. Ooh. Off it comes. Oh, and don't forget to disconnect the speaker, which is just on the inside there.
So with the door card removed, we now need to get behind the foam sheet and remove the two actuating rods from the back of the door handle. So if we just take a quick look at the workshop procedure for this, it's in section 76, chassis and body, page 33 and 34 of the P38 repair manual. And this is the diagram we're interested in here. You've got the latch, and then you've got the inside of the door handle, and you've got these two actuating rods between the two, which need to be removed, obviously, before removing the door handle. Now, I found that my card differed slightly from how it's depicted in here, because the workshop procedure wants you to start by removing the lower one, which is for the lock, which is the one that goes up and down when you physically turn the key in the driver's door lock. And it said there was a plastic retaining clip at the latch end of the rod. Now on mine there didn't seem to be such a clip, it was at the other end at the top. And as I'll explain a bit later, I actually found it easier to separate that retaining clip on the outside of the door once the handle had been released, and there was a bit of a gap between the handle and the door, but I'll explain that a bit later. The one you do want to remove, as per the diagram, is the one for the handle, the one that goes up and down when you pull and release the door handle to open the door. And that, as advertised, there's a little green retaining clip here marked number 5, which just twists off the latch, and then you can pull the rod horizontal inside the door and disconnect it from the handle cam end and set it aside before taking the door handle off.
One way or t'other, yeah, just round to the right slightly like that, it just sort of comes off, and that releases quite easily, kind of horizontally, so that it comes out of the inside of the handle. Right, so to actually release the handle itself, it's just this single Torx 25 bolt, which, despite having a slightly rusty appearance, it actually came off quite easily. I sprayed it with a little bit of WD-40 a few moments ago. So you release that, and then the handle should just slide forward slightly and come out of the door. So I've left the private lock rod attached, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull out the handle slightly so that the latch hook releases or comes through the door, and then here the lock rod, the private lock rod I should say, is still attached, and I'm going to have a much better view of the retaining clip there than I would do from trying to get it from inside the door. There, she's free. And then once you're disconnected at the lock end, you then just got to lever out the pivot point at the other end, just carefully without damaging the gasket that goes around the front end, and that just comes off like that. And I'll just pop the gasket back in place.
So with the handle off the car, this is where I found I needed the 2.5mm Allen key to remove this little bolt that was holding the cam and spring into the mechanism. With the pin or bolt removed, you'll find that the spring is under quite a lot of tension, so carefully study the orientation before removing it. So let me just try and demonstrate what I think the problem here is. So the old one is on the right hand side, and this cutout here is essentially where that pin that's inside the handle, or that protrusion, that plastic protrusion, whatever you want to call it, that goes into that gap there, and it's essentially when that motion of the door handle goes in and out, that's what changes the motion into the up and down required to move the rod. Now that protrusion there in of itself I think is a bit worn. Now I'm hoping that that doesn't matter for now, at least, because that seems to be integral to the handle. So and I don't particularly want to have to replace the whole handle, but we shall see. But if you compare the new and the old, what you see is that pin on the handle is essentially worn a bigger kind of curve there for itself, such that when it's going backwards and forwards, what I think it's kind of getting stuck there. Whereas if you look at the new one, it's a smaller cutout. It doesn't have any wear on it. Reassembly was largely trial and error. I can't say I came up with a definitive way of doing it, but what seemed to work for me was mounting the spring on the cam and then simultaneously engaging the cam with the handle and placing the long end of the spring into the back of the plastic that surrounds the lock. Then the short end of the spring needs to be tensioned by working it behind the little plastic stay that is moulded into the bottom of the cam. Finally, the opposite side of the cam from the handle needs to engage with a little groove that is in the lock casing and holds the whole thing together. If you move the handle out, actually, that sort of encourages the cam piece to come up, but it's nearly there. It's all just got to come up all in one fell swoop here. So I had to do that last bit off camera just because I had to hold the handle against my chest, because it was the only way I could get enough pressure on the spring as I was getting the plastic cam onto its kind of pivot. The little metal shaft now, I've got it partially in, just enough to hold the whole thing in place, but I just now need to tap it sort of through. And I'm going to try and do that with these long nose pliers here. The long nose pliers didn't really work, so what I did instead is I put it vertically in a vise and just used a large flat-headed screwdriver and a hammer just to drive the pin home. And then I'm just going to take the hammer and just give it a few taps on the top to drive it home. So I've just got to get the private lock rod back on. It's got this all weird retaining clip design on this is slightly different from that advertised in the workshop manual. I've just got to sort of encourage that back on somehow. There you go, that's one side. I've just got to get the bottom side on. So the retaining clip does seem to have distorted it just slightly. I'm just going to try and squeeze it sort of back in place a bit with the pliers so that it actually does its job and doesn't sort of rattle off when going over some pothole or off-roading or something. It just needs to be eased back. It's just sort of lost its elasticity a little bit. But it's a metal clip, so I should be able to sort of bend it
bend it back with the pliers.
So with the private lock rod reattached, the only remaining actions are to reattach the main rod for the handle to the latch and reinstall the Torx bolt that holds the handle to the door. So latch rod has now been attached. Let's see what happens. Seems pretty good to me. Just on a general point about opening P38 doors, it's much better to brace with your thumb against the fixed part of the handle, just where the lock barrel is, and then put pressure with your fingers just on the kind of inside curve at the back of the moving part of the handle here. Open it like that. You see people kind of yanking it like that, and it'll do it, but I think that is actually part of the reason why they wear, is because if you pull it like that, it just puts more strain on the mechanism in there. So I'm just going to do a final check inside the door to make sure that the two metal rods are indeed connected correctly and that they won't just pop off the next time we go over a speed bump. Otherwise, just got to tidy this up, put some fresh tape around the areas where the foam sheath has been torn, put the door card back on, reconnect the speakers, and then we're done. So if you found this video useful, do hit like and subscribe. Similarly, if you think I did anything wrong, could have done something better, please leave a comment below. I'm going to be doing a few more jobs on the P38 over the next few weeks, so if you're into the P38 content, please stay tuned. Otherwise, the Range Rover Classic and the R107 Mercedes will be back very soon.